View on economy as well as macros. No better than Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Government of India, joining us right now on the show. Mr. Ahluwalia, I really appreciate you taking the time out and speaking with us today. Recently, you stated that efforts to revive infrastructure investment would help in reverting to 8% growth in the next 3 years. What are the steps that are being planned, and when can we see implementation on the same?
Well, a lot of steps have been planned. I mean, mainly, the establishment of the Cabinet Committee on Infrastructure about a year ago, and a parallel setting up of a project monitoring group in the Cabinet Secretariat, which was meant to look at large projects, try to identify where they were getting held up, and sort of persuade the different ministries and sometimes the state governments to act more quickly. Now, this effort has had quite a lot of success. I don't have the numbers offhand, but, a couple of hundred projects which were stuck for various reasons are no longer stuck. The difference, of course, is that just when a project finds the regulatory impediments have been removed, for it to get on with more investment being made, there have to be other issues that have to be addressed. And I think finance for many of these projects probably has become an issue. I mean, there's been a global downturn. Banks are a little bit stressed because of the downturn, as is the case everywhere. Probably many of the promoters who started these projects have some financing difficulties. I'm sure they'll be able to handle them. But it's not the case that if the regulatory restrictions are removed, immediately people start pouring money and the investment revives. I would suspect that, to some extent, the fact that we are going through an election, it's quite possible that some of the larger commitments of money may well be held back, sort of wait till the election is over. So for all these reasons, the response has been a little muted if you look at reactions on the ground. But I'm quite hopeful that in the next 3 quarters, you'll see a pickup. And that's what most analysts, by the way, are projecting. I mean, virtually every analyst that you look at is projecting a growth during 2014-15, something of the order of 5.5%, compared to something below 5% for 2013-14. We had felt that, if the pickup is quicker, it could even be 6%. So somewhere between 5.5% and 6% is a reasonable growth forecast for the year 2014-15. But that depends very critically on the new government sending exactly the right signals. Now, I think everybody knows what the issues are. It's a great opportunity for a new government to sort of take these necessary steps and reassure investors.
Morning, Mr. Ahluwalia. Nikunj Dalmia also joining in. Many experts think that India's potential growth rate is now much lower than 8%. What is your take? And also, do you think that India's consumption story also has got challenged because of high inflation?
Well, it's a very good concept, what is a long-term growth rate, because, we do growth rates in 5-year periods. Now, we've done an analysis of the past, not including the last year, but sort of you look at the last 10 years or something like that, and use statistical devices to filter out global upturns and other kinds of cyclical things, then you end up with an underlying growth rate of about 7.4%. Okay? Now, this was a period when global growth was buoyant and there's uncertainty about the future. So I would not be surprised if the long-term growth potential of the Indian economy is somewhere between 7 and 7.5%. But right now we are below potential. So I think in the next 3 to 4 years we should be aiming at better than 7 to 7.4. But over a longer period, I mean, if India manages to grow, I would hope at 8% for several years. But suppose it's only 7.5%, I would not be so surprised that that's the long-term potential. I mean, after all, China is projecting growth rate at 7.5%. So the world has changed. Everybody else has slowed down also. And that is bound to affect us to some extent.
Mr. Ahluwalia, although the CCI has given clearance to a host of projects, industry participants say that actual results are yet to be felt. What are the hurdles here, and when can we expect to see results on ground?
Well, look, we certainly need such a problem-solving mechanism. I don't actually agree that the Cabinet Committee has not solve the problems that were posed to it. I mean, in a number of areas where decisions were getting delayed, the Cabinet Committee was able to resolve issues and come to a conclusion. I mean, for example, the fuel supply agreements for thermal power plants, about 78,000 megawatts worth of it hadn't been granted, and now it's almost 75,000 are done. So looking ahead, many of these plants now have more certainty. Of course, most of these plants were hoping that all the coal they'll get will be domestic. What has happened is they now have certainty. They're going to get so much domestic coal, the rest will have to be imported. But the certainty is there, and that's just a pricing issue. It's got to be reflected in the output price of energy. Similarly, I think on environmental clearances, several major projects that were held up. I mean, I know, for example, the Dibang hydroelectric project, that was held up, and the Cabinet Committee actually cleared it. Now, when you clear a project in a difficult area, that doesn't mean the project starts getting implemented straight away. People have to mobilize, people have to bring equipment to the right place. That'll take some time. But I feel that the dominant concern is that the financial environment facing investors is not as favorable as it was 3 years ago. And that doesn't mean that these things won't happen, but they take a little bit longer.
Right. Mr. Ahluwalia, a large part of reduction in CPI is due to food inflation. How much of food inflation pressure is simply due to supply and demand side factors, and what has been done and planned to ease supply side bottlenecks?
Well, as far as food is concerned, I mean, it is our view that you need much better arrangements for marketing, and unfortunately that's not something which is in the hands of the central government. I mean, my personal view is that state governments should liberalize markets for agriculture big time. And, for a variety of reasons, there are lots of vested interests here, and that doesn't happen. But the policy, at least in the Planning Commission, we've been saying that the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Acts need to be very seriously and effectively amended so that you can get more private sector into marketing, give an encouragement, better logistics, and all these kinds of things. On the supply side, of course, as far as agricultural production is concerned, the record so far is pretty good. I mean, in the last 5 or 6 years, the growth rate of agricultural production is better than it was in the previous years. Of course, we should do even better in future.
Right. Uncertainty looms on, what is the kind of impact that El Nino may have on sectors like agri-related and overall GDP. What's your take on that? And also, how do you see El Nino impacting food prices?
Well, it's too early to tell. I mean, I've seen some of the projections that, the weather is a teeny bit warmer, or rather the water is a teeny bit warmer than it was earlier. But, it's very, very early, and there are wide variations in the ranges of estimates. So if you get an El Nino which causes the monsoon to be less than ideal, obviously it'll have some effect on agricultural production. But, I think agricultural production is also now to a reasonable degree insulated from small variations in the weather. So it's far too early to start worrying about El Nino at this point. I mean, we get a better estimate by the middle of April from the Met, and probably a much better estimate just before the monsoon. So you need to wait for that.
Well, the RBI remains focused on achieving CPI at 8% by 2015 and 6% by 2016. Do you think RBI targets are slightly aggressive, and do you agree that CPI should now be the anchor inflation indicator?
No, I don't think so. I mean, look, honestly, inflation, we must be, either we are serious about inflation or you're not. And I don't believe that when you're setting targets in 8 and 6%, and you compare that with inflation around the world, I don't think anyone would call that aggressive. I think we do need to give a clear signal that we want to bring inflation down. And I don't believe, by the way, that is something that interrupts a revival of the growth momentum. I think the revival of the growth momentum relates to what we were discussing earlier. Get rid of implementation problems in the implementation of large projects. So if we can do both, control inflation and get the growth going again.
Mr. Ahluwalia, inflation all this while has been tackled only via monetary policy. At the government level, what do you think needs to be done to tackle inflation so that both RBI and government are on the same page?
Well, I don't want to get into this blame game of what's the RBI doing and what's the government doing. Frankly, I think they both need to coordinate their positions. I think whenever you look at the formal policy statements, basically the government's view is that we must bring the fiscal deficit under control, and that's exactly what is the right thing from the point of view of inflation control also. As far as the RBI is concerned, what they're really saying is we're watching inflation. Their problem at the moment is that inflation is still too high, but it's coming under control. Growth is too low, and we don't yet have the evidence that a strong revival is around the corner. So I think what the RBI has done is held its course. It's not made any significant changes. That's not an unreasonable thing under the present circumstances.
Mr. Ahluwalia, interest rate outlook, prolonged pause followed by interest rate hike, or will we see cut in interest rates? What's your understanding of the current interest rate regime?
You know, I've always, whenever I'm asked this question, I tend to say that, look, I fervently hope that we will have a reduction in real interest rates. And I do not believe that this can be achieved simply by operating on the nominal interest rate at the short-term end. So I think what Governor Raghuram Rajan is actually doing is presenting the right balance in all of this. Let's be clear. Bringing inflation down is going to make a major contribution to keeping real interest rates down, because the expectation of inflation is what pushes people away from financial savings into all kinds of real assets, including gold. So you need to tackle that. It's also true that, the revival of growth itself and the reduction in the fiscal deficit, those two things together will release a lot more money into the system. If the fiscal deficit isn't picking up too much of the financial savings of households, banks will have a lot more money to lend to the commercial sector, and that's what's going to bring the real interest rate down. Simply lowering the repo rate is not going to make banks suddenly lower their interest rate if they don't have any more money to lend. So frankly, I think this excessive focus on the short-term interest rate as if it was a magic bullet to bring down the long-term real interest rate is just wrong.
Mr. Ahluwalia, the EC has given its nod just 3 days ago for rolling out new bank licenses, post which the RBI gave the go-ahead to IDFC as well as Bandhan. How crucial is this development for the financial sector in India, according to you?
Well, I think the RBI's decision to implement its earlier statement that is going to open up banking licenses is an excellent move, and the fact that they've been able to do it, get the relevant permissions from the Election Commission, is also a very commendable thing. I think it gives a signal to the rest of the world that policies which generally are regarded as reform and efficiency oriented are not being held up merely because we're having an election. So I think from that point of view, it's an extremely positive signal.
But Mr. Ahluwalia, at the same time, do you think the government's rethink on gas pricing due to Election Commission's order to defer it has dented the reform process of the entire energy sector? Because big question marks are being raised, eyebrows are being raised on what will happen to the new gas price regime.
Well, look, I don't want to comment on a decision by the Election Commission to put something on hold. I think when you have an election going on, the Election Commission has constitutional and statutory authority to call it one way or call it the other way. And remember, it's only putting it on hold. I'm not aware of any move to change the basic decision. In a democratic environment, every decision is itself subject to criticism, and I'm sure that those who are not happy with the basis on which the decision was taken will remain unhappy, especially while an election is going on. But all we've got at the moment is putting something on hold, and I don't think anyone should read that to mean there's a change in the basic government's thinking. At least I hope not.
So what, according to you, should be the current government's 100-day agenda before June 1st and the new government kicks in?
The next 100 days, obviously, if you mean the next 100 days after the new government, that depends on the new government. And I'm sure that each possible government has its own agenda. But as far as the present government is concerned, I mean, obviously we cannot expect to have new policy initiatives. But, you know, running an economy is a 24/7 task, rather like some of your television channels. And I just hope that whoever is looking at whatever they're supposed to be looking at is got their eye on the ball and essentially making sure that whatever is now actually known policy is properly implemented. I don't think that that's going to be a big problem, quite honestly.